The Iliad for Latin students. The Aeneid is part of a larger tradition of epic myth. In order to truly understand the Aeneid, you need to understand the Iliad and the Odyssey. Of course, the best way to do that is to read Iliad and Odyssey over and over again, but that takes a lot of time and effort you may not have. Let's start with the legendary author of the Iliad and Odyssey, Homer. According to the legend, there was a blind genius poet named Homer who came up with the Iliad and Odyssey and had them written down. Some scholars believe that there could have been a man named Homer who was a genius poet, but it is much more likely that he is as mythical as the stories attributed to him. The Iliad and the Odyssey were born of a large oral tradition of storytelling in the ancient Greek world that may have stretched back as far as 1000 BCE. In this tradition, the stories were more fluid, and while the plot was likely fixed, it could be told in different ways and was composed in performance, much like how you might tell the same story to 5 different friends and not have it be the same each time. And then your friends might tell another 5 friends the same story, and the story changes even more to suit their own style of telling. The regularity in the epic then comes from a formulaic language based on the metrical pattern that helps the singer tell the story. How do we get the written epics as they are today? As the legend of Homer, the genius poet, grew, ancient scholars tried to take their sources for the Iliad and the Odyssey and condense it into one ideal text. This movement took place in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. The legend of the creation of the text is a strong indication that we are dealing with an important text. So what is it all about? The first word of the Iliad is Manus, or anger. The poet invokes the muse to tell the anger of Achilles. But why is Achilles so angry? The Iliad starts in the middle of the story. To understand that, we need to talk about the 10 years leading up to the Iliad, the very beginning of the Trojan War. The Trojan War begins with the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. Helen is the daughter of Zeus and Leda. Because Zeus seduced Leda in the form of a swan, she gave birth to Helen as an egg from which Helen was later hatched. Her beauty was well known throughout all of Greece, which at the time was less of a unified nation and more of a variety of city-states and kingdoms that warred with each other more often than not. Worried that marrying off Helen could spark a war, Helen's adoptive father called together a host of suitors from around Greece to seek her hand in marriage. Ultimately, they decided to allow Helen to choose her own husband from the suitors, but before she announced her choice, all of the suitors swore an oath that they would respect her decision, and if she were ever threatened, that they would all come to her husband's aid to protect her. This oath sworn, Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, who was the brother of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. Both brothers were incredibly powerful forces in the Greek world at this time. But meanwhile, the gods are stirring up trouble in Asia Minor. Zeus spotted an attractive young Trojan boy named Ganymede, and in the form of an eagle, kidnapped him and swept him off to Mount Olympus. However, Zeus had to justify Ganymede's presence to his wife Hera, so he told the other gods that he brought Ganymede to Olympus to be his cupbearer. But there was a problem. The gods already had a cupbearer, Hebe. Hebe was the daughter of Zeus and Hera was not pleased about her daughter being replaced by Zeus's latest conquest. To appease Hera, Zeus had Ganymede marry Hebe, and says that they will share their duties. The gods throw a great wedding ceremony, but they decided not to invite Eris, the goddess of chaos, because who invites chaos to a wedding? Eris, deeply offended by the slight, decides to cause trouble. She takes a golden apple and engraves it with the word Calliste, for the fairest. 3 goddesses begin to argue over whom the apple belongs to: Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite. The goddesses ask Zeus to settle the dispute, but he knows better than to play favorites between his wife and daughters, so he selects a Trojan shepherd to judge the contest. However, this shepherd was not really a shepherd. He is actually a prince of Troy named Paris, son of Priam and Hecuba. When Paris was born, his mother, Hecuba, had a dream that he would be a firebrand and would destroy Troy. Worried by this portent, they sent him away from the city to die of exposure. However, Paris survived, and after his judgment of the beauty contest, returned to Troy, where they no longer seemed to worry about the portent of doom. Little did they know that the result of the judgment would cause their doom. Each of the goddesses attempted to bribe Paris. Hera offered to make Paris king of Europe and Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and skill in battle. And Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. Paris ultimately chose Helen. As we remember, Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. Paris and his brother Hector went to Sparta, where Paris fell in love with Helen. In some versions, Helen also fell in love with him and left willingly. In other versions, she was kidnapped. Either way, Helen was taken from Sparta to Troy, and the suitor's oath to protect her was now enacted. Led by Menelaus' brother Agamemnon, the Greeks began to assemble at the city of Argos so they could sail to Troy and get Helen back from the Trojans. There were many famous Greeks among their forces besides Menelaus and Agamemnon. Odysseus of Ithaca was famously clever at battle strategy. Wise old Nestor of Pylos was coming. Ajax, son of Telamon, was said to be the second best of the Greeks, and Achilles was perhaps the most famous of all. He was the son of Peleus, of Phthia in northern Greece, and the sea nymph Thetis. It was prophesied that any son of Thetis would be stronger than his father, so the gods made her marry a mortal to avoid a war among the gods. When Achilles was just a baby, Thetis took him to the river Styx at the edge of the underworld. She submerged him in the waters to make him invulnerable. But, unable to enter the waters herself or let him go, she had to hold him by the heel, which became his one weak point. There are many additional legends that surround the Trojan War, and that in itself is one of the most important aspects of the epic tradition. The Trojan War and the stories associated with it stand at the center of Greek mythology. There are many aspects of the story that are repetitive and parallel. It is, after all, called the epic cycle. After the Greeks sail for Troy, they spend 10 years besieging the city with very little success. The Iliad begins in the 10th year of the war. Neither side is winning. Remember, Achilles is angry. Why? To understand why, we need to talk about honor and war prizes in the ancient world. From what we know of ancient warfare, it consisted largely of raiding parties to capture various spoils of war: armor, gold, and slaves. These spoils were gathered, and those warriors who showed themselves honorable in battle got to select from them. After raiding a nearby village, Agamemnon, who was in charge of the Greek forces, took Chryseis, daughter of Chryses, as a slave. Achilles similarly acquired Briseis. However, Agamemnon was deeply unlucky. His choice of captive was the daughter of a priest of Apollo, who attempted to ransom his daughter back from Agamemnon. But Agamemnon, who was arrogant, refused, which angered Apollo. Apollo, in turn, sent a plague to destroy the Greek troops. After weeks of death, Agamemnon was pressured into returning Chryseis, much to his embarrassment. Because Achilles led the Greeks to pressure him, and in general Agamemnon was jealous of Achilles' skill in battle, Agamemnon took Briseis from Achilles, which caused Achilles deep shame and anger. He swore that he would not return to battle until Agamemnon apologized to him and returned Briseis. Many see Achilles as motivated by love, but the larger issue is not his affection for Briseis, but the insult to his honor. Briseis was property of Achilles that should not have been violated. Agamemnon had taken an unusual amount of authority over the Greeks, who had never before been led under one commander. The disagreement was largely over power and honor, not love. Achilles complains of the insult to his mother Thetis, who goes to Zeus. Zeus, as it happens, owes her a favor, and he agrees to make the Greeks lose until Achilles returns, thereby increasing his honor even further. But the story is even more complex. Achilles went to war with his best friend, Patroclus. Some scholars believe that Achilles and Patroclus may even have been lovers based on subsequent events. Patroclus is deeply sympathetic to the dying Greeks throughout the Iliad. He decides to wear Achilles' armor and head into battle to help. Dressed in his distinctive armor, all the Trojans believe he is Achilles, and Patroclus ends up fighting the Trojan prince Hector. Hector was the best of the Trojans and a man of great honor. After a long battle, he slays Patroclus and strips him of Achilles' armor, realizing that he has not yet slain Achilles. There is yet another prophecy surrounding the Trojan War, this one about Achilles. Achilles is fated to die at Troy shortly after the death of Hector. And now that Hector has slain Patroclus, Achilles now has a reason to seek the death of Hector, and therefore his own death. Achilles, hearing the news of Patroclus' death, is one of the most moving scenes in all of literature. 3 men have to hold him down to prevent him from slitting his own wrists at the sight of Patroclus' body. His pain and agony at the loss is one that no one ever forgets waiting. Achilles' grief hardens into a resolve to kill Hector. Hephaestus forges him a new set of armor, and the next day he rides into battle, striking fear into the hearts of the Trojans. He fights a river god and wins. Finally, he finds Hector on the field of battle and chases him around the city 3 times. Unable to outrun Achilles, Hector finally turns to face him in battle. They fight. Hector attempts to reason with him, but Achilles responds that there are no pacts between lions and men. Achilles slays Hector, but his rage has not abated. He ties Hector's corpse to the back of his chariot and drags his body around the walls of Troy several times before bringing it back to the Greek camp on the beach to be eaten by dogs and birds. Meanwhile, the news of Hector's death has reached his father, King Priam. That evening, guided by Hermes himself, Priam enters the Greek camp and visits Achilles to beg for the body back. Initially, Achilles refuses, but as he speaks with Priam further, he begins to think of his own father, who will never see him again since he is fated to die in Troy. He thinks about how his father will never get to bury his body, and in a moment of shared humanity, Achilles relents and returns the body to Priam. The Iliad ends here, but the story of the Trojan War continues. Achilles is killed by an arrow shot by Paris that strikes him in the heel when he gets too close to the walls of Troy. Within a year, the Greeks devise a plan to sack Troy. Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, who also goes by the name Pyrrhus, meaning fire, a reference to his fiery red-gold hair, arrives. Odysseus comes up with a plan to build a great wooden horse to hide soldiers in and leave on the beach. The rest of the Greek forces sail behind the island of Tenedos, where the Trojans can't see them, and they leave behind a man named Sinon, who tricks the Trojans into bringing the horse into the city. Thinking the Greeks have left, the Trojans celebrate. Under the cover of darkness, the Greeks exit the horse, sneak through the city, and open the gates to let in the rest of the Greek forces, who have sailed back after sunset. The city is destroyed. The Trojans are killed, held captive, or scattered across the Mediterranean. The Iliad is a war story. There is a lot more to it than what I've outlined already, but it is an important story of anger, honor, and myth. The gods are constantly intervening in the lives of mortals. Mortals are ambitious and constantly striving for power and influence. The Greeks and Trojans must demonize the other in order to continue to fight, and yet at the same time they are able to find a common humanity in each other. The Iliad is also one of the most important pieces of Greek literature. The Romans lived in a world where Hellenic culture was dominant. They had adopted Greek myth as their own. They read Greek philosophy and imitated Greek architecture. Rome conquered Greece in 146 BCE, but Greece in many ways conquered the Romans culturally. The Aeneid builds on the tradition of the epic cycle, taking the established character Aeneas and making him the founding ancestor of the Romans as he flees from the burning city of Troy. The Aeneid begins with a journey home from Troy, like the Odyssey, more on that in the next video, and ends with a war like the Iliad. The themes of epic are consistent across all 3 works. establishing the Romans as part of the epic tradition.